All right, everybody, welcome back to the Forge Podcast, and we're just starting to go through this topic and concept of hell, and I want to do a short episode. Well, it turned out to be kind of long here, but we're going to do it on the ancient Israelite view of the afterlife that you see in the Old Testament and how that relates to the New Testament, because the stuff that you find in the Old Testament concerning the afterlife, it'll really surprise you. And it all is wrapped up in this idea of what we think of hell. So for some of you checking out this podcast, I'm sure this particular episode is going to seem like a little bit of an extra credit episode, and it gets a little historical, which I know can get boring for some, but I absolutely want to dig into this during our What the Hell series. Because when we hit the New Testament, Jesus seems to proclaim quite candidly, as if it's just a matter of fact, that one, life exists beyond death, and two, that there will be a resurrection of the dead into new physical bodies, and lastly, three, that in some form or fashion, there's going to be a final judgment in dealing with a person's sinful state of being, and where all evil is confronted with God's fiery and intense love. Those are three things that Jesus teaches very blatantly and obviously, right? And what I find interesting with all that is that when we look back at the Old Testament, we don't see these things being expressed very clearly and hardly at all in the Old Testament. You can't draw a straight line from what the Old Testament's view of the afterlife is and match it up succinctly with what Jesus says. It's just weird, man. It seems as if Jesus just pops on the scene and starts teaching very new revelations about the afterlife and new ideas about the fate of humankind. Yet because it's all coming from God's mouth, right? From God who came in the flesh in the person of Jesus, we Christians just take what Jesus says and runs with it without blinking an eye, even though much of what he says doesn't have much Old Testament roots. So what I want to do here is show what the earliest pages and writers of the Old Testament thought of concerning the afterlife, and trace the development of their concepts of the afterlife and the resurrection and the ideas of final judgment like hell as we move through the historical prophetic narrative of the Old Testament books. So that way we can trace its understanding and try to link it to what Jesus revealed of us in the New Testament. Make sense? All right, let's do this. Let me start with this. At least let's start with the concepts that are in the very beginning of the Bible, way back in the book of Genesis, where humans first come on the scene. Genesis chapter 1 details the creation story, where God is shown to be bringing everything into existence. First declaring, "Let there be light." Next by separating the waters from the dry land, and then by creating plants and then animals. And then finally on the sixth day, the creation narrative says this. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creepy thing that creeps on the ground." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Okay, that passage gives us a really cool picture of how God created both male and female human beings. It says that he created them after his own image. As that text said, in the image of God, he created them. And it's from this passage that we get the two Latin words that describe this inherent property that humans all have, the imago Dei, the image of God. And there's so much to say about this imago Dei that we could probably do a whole season of episodes about that one incredibly vast subject. But what I wanted to bring out from this passage is that nowhere in the text here, or in any other place in the Bible, does it say exactly what being made in the image of God means. Get it? Are we supposed to think that God has a head and a torso and 2 arms and 2 legs? I mean, is that the image of God? Does this mean that God gave us a rational thinking mind like him? Does it mean that we have been given the ability to choose between right and wrong? Does the Imago Dei mean that we have consciousness in a way that's similar to God? Or does being made in God's image mean that we have some type of authority to rule over things like God? I mean, nobody knows exactly, right? It doesn't say. We're pretty much left to speculate on our own what the Imago Dei is. Which has led some to conclude that being made in the image of God means something much more transcendent. Some take the Imago Dei to mean that humans have been made spiritual. That in part, we share the essence of God's divine nature. All right, what am I talking about? Well, what I'm talking about is that the Imago Dei could mean that we have a spiritual part of us that is more than just molecules of matter, more than just flesh and blood, that humans are somehow more than just physical beings, that we're spiritual beings. Now, by that, of course, we mean spiritual beings intended to live within this physical body, right? But spiritual beings to some degree, nonetheless. And if we take this idea and run with it, then this question comes up that I addressed on episode 13 in my series on Born from Above, which is, well, what is the origin of our human spirit then, or our human soul? Where did it come from? How did it get here? And how does it survive after death? Or does it even survive after death? See what I'm getting at? You know, how this is all concerning the afterlife. Okay, guys, so some folks, like the early church father Origen, I mean, he believed that the human spirit was something that God created long before humans were created. He taught that God first created these spirits up in the heavenly realm, and that God actually sustains, once they're created, they're sustained forever. They're everlasting, that once they're created, they are made in the image of God, to be everlasting, the Imago Dei, which means since God lives forever, the human spirit will live on into eternity as well. Now for Origen, these, for him specifically, these pre-existent spirits, they had some sort of fall from grace where they turned away from God, left their state of glory, and to be restored, these spirits get inserted or united into a human body so that they can go through, growth and testing, maturity, and refinement so as to turn back to God. Now, Origen was condemned later, as a heretic by the Catholic Church for a lot of his beliefs. And most Christians today don't hold to this view about the human spirit being pre-existent, except the Church of the Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ, the LDS Church, formerly known as Mormons. Now, I don't hold that view either. However, most mainline Orthodox, evangelical, Christians, they do believe that our human soul or our human spirit, once it's created, it retains an everlasting property. That it just goes on living forever into eternity, even in the event that the physical body dies off, right? And that, guys, is where we get this idea of heaven and hell. Heaven is the good place where these human souls and spirits go, and hell is the bad place where these everlasting human spirits and soul can go, right? But hold the phone, guys, because what we're about to see here on this podcast is that understanding, it's rather new. It's a Christian view of the afterlife, and not the Old Testament and Hebrew Bible view. Surprised? Well, certainly I was. And this would be the main point that I'm trying to get across in this episode. So stick with me for a while to see how this all works out. If we continue in this Genesis creation story and get into chapter 2, verse 7, it gives us a more detailed description of what God did on the sixth day of creation when he created human beings. That verse says, "Then the Lord formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed in him into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living creature." It's beautiful imagery. And notice that you see God forming human beings out of the dust of the ground, which is that part of our humanity which we normally think to be our physical part, our physical component, the flesh and blood, molecules of matter. It's just dust, or stardust, as scientists will say today. But at the same time, we also see this breathing of the breath of life into humans. And that means there's a duality here in this passage. The dust of the ground and God breathing life. And it's specifically here, with this breathing of life, where the passage says that the human, the Adam, becomes a living creature. Or in some translations, a living soul. So it's right here in chapter 2 that we see the physical part of man being made out of dust. And then we see something else happening where God is breathing in his breath of life. And it's this breathing of life that is which then completes the human being into a living soul. Now, I know I'm breaking this down to a deep, super base foundational level here, and this might seem really boring, but there's a reason why I'm doing this, so just hang on a second while I make this point. This breath of life, right, that God breathes into Adam, this is another concept that theologians and academics and pastors and priests and regular Joes and Janes speculate about as to what this means, right? Just like the Imago Dei. Is this breath of life, is this talking about God actually putting in some type of human soul into Adam? Does this mean that God put an everlasting spiritual part into humans that will go on living even after the physical being has died? Or is this breath of life just saying that God kicked off the life of the first human being by animating it? And then human beings were then off and running on their own. That last one kind of makes sense because, well, you don't see God breathing life into the next human beings that are created, right? God doesn't breathe life into Eve or life into Cain or breathe life into Abel or Noah or anybody else. God just does that to Adam alone. And nobody today breathes spiritual life or breathes life into a newborn to get them to exist either, do they? No, human beings just create themselves through physical procreation via sex. That's called progeny, like where you create offspring. We can do it in ourselves. We don't need any outside, addition in order to create our own children. So this breathing of life that God does here just for Adam could be, just imagery for saying that life comes from God, and although humans are merely dust of the earth, their life is intimately connected and dependent upon God. It could just mean that. However, others see more going on here than merely God kickstarting life with his breath. And they believe that this passage is teaching us that God creates every human being with the Imago Dei, the human soul or spirit that has life in itself, that is independent of the physical body, and that it even survives beyond death. That's that breathing of life. So that's the debate you find with people who read the Bible. When God breathes into Adam, is he trying to convey the message to us that human beings have some part of them that's an everlasting spirit that lives on forever after physical death? And that's what the Imago Dei is? Or are humans just flesh and blood and made out of the dust of the earth? Scripture goes both ways on this. Well, here's the interesting part about this whole thing that gets to the topic of this episode. When you examine the Old Testament, going forward from this point, you don't find any strong evidence that these ancient people cared that much about the afterlife. Or if they did, gee whiz, they certainly didn't give much attention to it in these ancient biblical writings. That's what you find. Let me show you what I mean. First of all, in the next chapter, Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve fall from grace, and they eat, of course, from that unsacred tree of the knowledge of the good and evil. And once the consequences, one of the consequences then, that God shares with them afterward are these declarations from chapter 3, verses 17 and 19. Because you've listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree, Adam, of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it should bring up for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it, the ground, were you taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Did you catch that little bit at the end there? In God's response to Adam and Eve's sin, God tells Adam the whole ground, the physical land, the soil of the earth, it's now going to be cursed because of their behavior. And included in this curse, God tells Adam that it was from the ground that Adam was taken and created. And then God says very plainly here at the end of verse 19 that you are dust. And to dust you shall return. No, there's nothing here about an eternal, everlasting soul or spirit. There's nothing here about the non-corporeal spiritual part of a human being living beyond death. God just says, you're dust. And possibly indicating that dust is all that a human being is. Just a biochemical existence. And it's back to that dust as your body and bones disintegrates back to the earth that human beings return to. So right off the bat, you see almost a complete negligence of the human soul or spirit from these ancient writers in the opening pages of the book of Genesis. If the ancients were concerned about the fate of their soul or their spirit, well, they certainly didn't include it when they recorded what God said to Adam after the fall. That, or the afterlife, just wasn't significant of an experience to make mention of it. Right? That's what I'm getting at here. This latter idea, that the afterlife wasn't that significant of an experience to make mention of it, it goes right along with what the other cultures of that ancient Near East Mesopotamian area believed. Right? The Israelite people and the people of the Bible, they didn't just come to be in like a vacuum, like all by themselves. They had all types of people around them. And all these cultures shared with each other about, different ideas. So many of the Mesopotamian people, like the Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians, they believed that there really wasn't much going on in the afterlife. All these people were together in the same area. Their views on the afterlife were kind of like a dark, shadowy, ghostly, not very exciting afterlife. I mean, there wasn't any hope that there's going to be life from the dead afterwards, like a resurrection. And it didn't matter how you lived your life. Everybody ended up in pretty much the exact state of being. You're just like a ghost or a shadow of who you were, with very little activity going on, with no progress towards any type of goal or future hope or building of anything in the afterlife, right? It was just a pretty dim place. And not surprisingly, that's exactly what you see for the most part in the book of Genesis. When people die, there's basically nothing about them that says they go on and live in the afterlife. The whole afterlife concept is missing from these early pages in the first couple dozen chapters of Genesis. The only thing we see recorded in relation to one's death is that when a person went to die, it says they're gathered up to their people, gathered to their ancestors. That's all, the only phrase you really find in these early pages of Genesis, with this happening to, this declaration's made right around the end of a person's life, like with Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael, and Jacob. All these people, when they died, Genesis says that they were gathered to their people. Now, when you first kind of look at this, it seems that phrase, gathered to your people, is just a reference to a dead person's bones, or that they fulfilled their course in life. Back in those ancient days, when people died, they were buried, and their bones were collected and placed with the bones of their deceased relatives, kind of like a boneyard of your family. That's how you're gathered to your people. We see this instruction given by Joseph right before he dies. Now, Joseph's story in Genesis, he becomes this powerful ruler in Egypt. And where he was there, a famine throughout the whole land of Israel and the ancient Near East came up, and he brought his family, the ancient Israelites, down from the land of Canaan to live with them in Egypt. But in Genesis chapter 50, right before Joseph dies, he tells them, hey, make sure that when you come out of this place that my bones are carried up from here. Take me with you. And in Exodus 13, it says that Moses indeed fulfilled his promise and took Joseph's bones with him when he led the Israelites out of the captivity of Egypt. Presumably to have those bones buried in the family's original ancestral tomb back in Canaan when they got into the promised land. So there's something about the bones of the people that was significant after a person died. And that's really all the emphasis that we see in these early pages of the Bible concerning when somebody dies. But I'm going to argue both sides here because, however, some have argued that being gathered to your people, that phrase, this gathered to your ancestors that you find in Genesis, it actually meant that your soul or your spirit goes back to the spirit world where the other past family members are living forever in the afterlife. And that certainly could have been true for, that could have been their belief for people back then, because that kind of an afterlife idea, it would have matched perfectly with what the other cultures around, these ancient biblical people believed. But even if that's true, you kind of have to read that into the text, because there's nothing in these early texts that talk about any type of existence or social behavior with other spirits, or having regrets, or partying, or suffering, or anything like that in the afterlife. There's nothing in these early biblical texts that talk about any concern about the afterlife at all. There's nothing in these ancient texts that would give any indication that there was like a good place to go when you die or a bad place to go when you die based on your behavior. Nope, none of that at all. There's no direct ties in the early pages of the biblical history to even if there was an afterlife. It's pretty much like void. In these early pages, there's certainly no New Testament concepts about a resurrection of the dead, where disembodied spirits come back into a physical body to walk the earth again. Where there's no talk about a final judgment being served at the end of the age, and no talk of a restoration of the earth into a paradise. There's nothing like that at all when you read these stories and these passages and these pages of Genesis here. Everything's focused on the physical life, the here and now. All of God's judgments and warnings that are doled out deal with one's physical life. And when you eventually died, well, that was it. There was no more mention of you. Your story ended, except that, whatever you had in your prior existence might be told as a story to your people. So no, you don't see any talk about contacting departed spirits in Genesis or receiving messages from the dead, or that there is some type of hope that the departed were going to come back in a physical existence again. It's as if the people that died were just totally gone, and now just a memory, or at best, we're in like this untouchable realm of the dead where they were merely a shadow or a ghost of one's former self. Yep, it seems just as God said in Genesis chapter 3, "For out of the dust you are taken, for you are dust, and to the dust you will return." Well, as a side note, some of you listeners might be saying, "Oh no, don't you forget, Vinny, about mentioning Enoch." Because doesn't Genesis chapter 5 say that Enoch walked with God and then he was no more because God took him away, right? Isn't that one example where we see God extending one's existence into the afterlife? Well, I don't have time to get into that whole oddball passage, but one thing I will say is that the text never says that Enoch died, did it? So one could easily make the claim that Enoch, he never went into an afterlife because God extended his physical life. All right, to wrap this Genesis talk up, I personally take the position that humans do have a spirit or a soul that extends beyond physical death. And I talked about how I arrived at that conclusion and some of the metaphysics behind it in episode 13, entitled "Born from Above, the Human Spirit." So you can check that out later if you're interested. But for the people and the authors of the book of Genesis, if they also believe this, boy, they certainly didn't show much concern about the reality of the afterlife, and they made no matter-of-fact statements about it. So that's kind of it in what we gather from the book of Genesis and from the ancient patriarchs here. Now, the next development that we see is this word Sheol. There's a lot of controversy around this word. Now, Sheol, it is mentioned in the book of Genesis a few times, but all of them are near the end of the book. And they're in the context of Jacob mourning for his sons Joseph and Benjamin. And what is Sheol? Well, what we're going to see is that it mostly represents a state of death, the state of the end of your life. And all these times it's used in Genesis, which is like 5 or 6 or 7, the grief expressed about Sheol isn't so much about that place, it's that Joseph is pained by the idea of going down to Sheol on a sad note. On a grieving note, that he has to, die in grief and anguish. You can easily just substitute the word grave here for Sheol. That's what Jacob is concerned about. He doesn't want to live out his last days and then just die while he's in this grieving state. That's nowhere to die, right? However, some folks look at these Genesis passages about Sheol and they make the claim that the very concept of Sheol is the afterlife. That Sheol is this realm of the dead where departed, disembodied spirits go. And again, yes, of course, it's possible that the ancient Israelites had this view in mind, and it's actually a really good possibility that this was the ancient Israelite view, given that this was what other people of the ancient Near East also believed, as I mentioned earlier. But here's the kicker, guys. There's nothing at all in these Sheol passages in Genesis to describe anything about a life after death. Get it? There's nothing said about what one does there. There's nothing said about what this existence is like. There's nothing said about what type of interactions you're going to have with others and so on. In fact, what you mostly find is that Sheol is just represented as it's the end of your existence. It's where things go kaput. And I don't have time to read all these Genesis passages, but example here, Genesis 37:35. The first time where Sheol is used, Jacob is recorded saying, "Oh no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Or, "I shall go down to the grave," you could translate that, "to my son mourning." This is right after Jacob's other sons threw Joseph into a pit, sold him into slavery, took Joseph's coat of many color, spilled animal blood on it to try to convince Jacob that his favorite son Joseph had been torn to bits and died by a wild animal. And you know what? Their little thing, it worked. That's what he believed. And Jacob is now expressing this deep, deep sadness that he is going to go to his grave in mourning and sadness. Oh, that's a horrible way to die. And notice that Jacob isn't saying, well, at least my son and I will be reunited in Sheol. Or that, I know I'll see my son again in Sheol and we'll rejoice. Or that, at least we'll be in paradise and all will be well when we die. No, there's nothing like that at all here. Instead, there's a deep sadness about entering Sheol. There's no hope expressed of like a consciousness that's going to bring you any future joy. There's no hope that you're going to have a shared relationship with others in Sheol. It's just darkness. Rather, the emphasis about bringing up Sheol is that he's going to go down to his grave in sorrow. That his life is going to end that way, and that's how it goes. So if there is an afterlife, boy, Jacob isn't expressing any kind of hope in it. And if departed souls of humans, if they are conscious down there in Sheol, well, the ancient biblical writings doesn't make it appear like they are conscious of each other or have any joyful interaction with each other, right? So no, I don't see any strong, compelling evidence, at least in this stage of development in the ancient Israelite story, that there even is an afterlife, or an afterlife that, is that has suffering or joy. There's not a heaven or hell. That's not going on at all here. Moving on now, when we get to Exodus, most of us are familiar with the Israelite story. Although Joseph, as you just talked about, is sold into slavery, he becomes powerful in rulership in Egypt and brings all of his family down to Canaan to live with them in Egypt to save them from that famine. But later Joseph dies and the Egyptians forget about Joseph, and by this point the Israelites are huge in number and they're enslaved by the Egyptians. And then Moses comes like 400 years later, frees them from Egyptian rule, and leads them through the Red Sea and brings them to Mount Sinai to meet their ancestral God and to receive the glorious law. Now, here, guys, at Mount Sinai, you would think, and all the laws and instructions given, 613 laws in all, give or take, that God would give some kind of indication of the existence of the afterlife. Right? Like God would give a definite or a definitive warning to the people like, hey, if you do bad things, the law says you're going to go to a very bad place when you die. Or that bad behavior leads to hell. I mean, this podcast is about hell, so I might as well bring that topic in here again. But guys, there's nothing at all mentioned in the Mosaic law about the afterlife. I mean, nothing, not one commandment, not one stroke of the pen. God doesn't give them any inkling about if there even is a life after death and what that life would be like, and make sure you live good on earth so you don't go to hell, or do good things so you go to heaven, or no instructions, nothing about it. And all the warnings and consequences for sin that are in the law. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. And there's a lot of harsh, bloody, violent punishments for breaking the law. Not one of them speak about the afterlife. All the consequences for sin are concerned about one's physical life here and now while you're breathing on earth. Isn't that just weird, man? Yes, from Exodus all through Deuteronomy, where the law of Moses is laid out, God doesn't say anything about life after death, or instructs his people to be good persons, to not sin so they don't go to hell or suffer a bad or worse afterlife. Nope. Everything in the Bible up to this point is focused on the here and now, the physical life, what happens on earth. And when you die, you just go to the grave. You go to Sheol. And that's the end of your story as far as the living are concerned. There's not any judgment. And it didn't matter how you lived your life. Everybody's going to Sheol to suffer the same dark, shadowy fate. When you die, I don't know about you guys, but when I think about this, giving the law and how it's just exempt from that, it just seems totally off to me. I mean, God doesn't endorse this idea of Sheol, nor does he give a new view of any different sort of afterlife. It's just as if he doesn't deal with it at all. And that's the witness that you find in the early stages of the history of the people of Israel. No robust afterlife, no resurrection, no judgment for one's sins committed in the physical life, no hope of restoration to the cosmos, and no victory over evil. It's just weird. Moving on again. Now we're going to progress in Israel history. We're going to move past Mount Sinai and giving the law and the wandering in the wilderness and the transition in the promised land. There's still, after all that, no development of this concept of death. The Israelites merely continue with the same ambiguous themes about death that they had prior. All right, so like the book of Judges, which documents the conquest of the promised land, it doesn't develop the idea of death or give us any new information about an afterlife. When we move into the history of Israel's kings and their judges in the books of Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and all those things, there's hardly any mention of Sheol at all. The few mentions of it echo the same idea of the book of Genesis. Just a general weariness of going there, hoping to not go there, but recognizing it's a place of finality and the end of one's life story. No one comes back. It's the pit. It's death as far as the living are concerned with it. In 1 Kings chapter 2, it says that when King David died, that he slept with his ancestors. That's it, folks. As if David just went to sleep or rested. He was gathered to his people, maybe to a place of resting, where you're inanimate. Or if there was this belief in an afterlife, there was nothing really going on down there in the center of the earth in Sheol that was worthy of to mention, right? Whatever conflicts you had in this life, well, they were over. Whatever progress or accomplishments you made in the history of the world, well, that was over. There was no hope lying beyond one's final destination of Sheol. You weren't going to be resurrected. It was a place of utter finality. That's all you get about the afterlife throughout Israel's history during, as we mentioned, Genesis and through Exodus and Deuteronomy giving the law and Joshua, Judges, and all the history of the kings. That's it. There's just nothing there. However, we are going to see now, going forward, a little bit more in the development of this afterlife as we move through the latter books of the history of the Israelites with their prophetic writings. But before I comment on that, I want to bring up the books of Psalms and Job real quick, because both of these books, they're like treasure troves for that word Sheol and all the concepts of death surrounding it. Job is super interesting. First of all, even though we usually find it placed in the Old Testament near the Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, many historians think that it could actually be placed somewhere around Genesis 11, after that, and right before Genesis 12, which would make it really one of the oldest writings that we have in the Bible. And Job talks a lot about Sheol. It would take us a couple hours to get through all those passages, so I can only say a little, but you can check this out for yourself. But in all of Job's passages here about Sheol, once again, there's nothing to be said about any hope in Sheol. There's no talk about social activity or community or relationships happening in Sheol. There's no talk about hell. There's no suffering. There's no punishment. There's no judgment or any ideas of like that happening after you die. Nobody gets judged in Sheol for being good or for being bad in their physical life. Sheol is not hell in the way many Christians think of hell today, and which is a misnomer, because in like your King James Bible, I believe that in the Old Testament, some places they translate Sheol as hell, which gives a person a totally wrong idea. According to the Old Testament, Sheol is just a place where everybody goes when you die. Whether that be just the literal grave where you turn back into dust, or an underworld where people are just shells of themselves and they're inanimate. It's a place of rest and everything's shrouded in darkness and chaos and echoes of yourself. There's certainly no talk of returning back from Sheol, as if God was going to one day restore someone's life through a resurrection to a physical body. Nothing like that at all. Job chapter 7 verse 9 says this: "As the cloud fades and vanishes, so those who go down to Sheol do not come up." Boom, there it is. In chapter 3, after experiencing all types of evil and suffering, Job finally responds to this wretched condition he finds himself in by saying, man, I wish I was just dead. He says in verse 13, "If I was dead instead, I would be lying down and quiet. I'd be asleep. Then I would be at rest." He goes on in verses 16 and 19 talking about this place of the dead, saying, "There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They do not hear the voice of their taskmasters. The small and the great are there." See, everyone's just, it's commonplace. "And the slaves are free from their masters." No, Job isn't talking about a blissful heaven here. He's just saying that people are in a rested state. They're lying down. They're inanimate. Done from doing things. Done from the crap in the world. They're just dead. It's over. So that's definitely one perspective you can take about the ancient biblical view about Sheol. To be in Sheol means it's the end of your existence as you know it. But then there are passages like this where Job says in Job chapter 10, as he cries out to God for hardship, he says, "Why did you even bring me out of the womb? Would that I had died before and I had seen me, and were as though I had not been carried from the womb to the grave. Are not my days few? Then cease, God, from all this crap you're putting on me, and leave me alone, that I may find a little cheer before I go. And I shall not return to the land of darkness, and to deep shadow, the land of gloom, like thick darkness, a deep shadow without any order, where light is as thick as darkness." So although most of what we looked at up to this point about the afterlife is that life just ends, well, you do come across a few passages like this where it hints at some possible conscious afterlife. But notice what Job says here, that this could be, well, it could be just merely figurative language and not really talking about living out some kind of conscious reality beyond your death. But if we take this literally, that Sheol is the realm of the dead and some kind of life after death, well, man, this is a sketchy place. Nope, there's no hell, no flames, or any type of judgment of God or suffering due to how you lived on earth. No punishment, none of that. Instead, the concept of Sheol has this nebulous language of darkness and deep shadow and the land of gloom and thick darkness, without any order, where light is as thick as darkness, and rest and sleeping. Get it? And what's different here from our Christian view of hell is that the Old Testament describes that everybody falls into the same fate when they go to Sheol. Good or bad, just or unjust, the righteous and the unrighteous. There's no difference. There's no distinction. All go there, none return. If there is some kind of a consciousness, physical existence after death in the shadowy realm of Sheol, as some suggest, well, then it's not much of an existence at all, is it? I mean, but at least, as Job says, it'd be better to die and go there, because at least you would not have to be dealing with all the kinds of horrible suffering he was going through at that time. The book of Psalms is no different. It's in that it's loaded with references to Sheol. And I'll just pick out a couple of these, but notice that when we see, when we look at these, we're going to see the same things here. We're predominantly, Sheol is just talking about the grave, the resting place of the dead, where your existence ceases to be. For example, Psalm 6 verse 5 says, "For in death there is no remembrance of you, God. In Sheol, who will give you praise?" If you're conscious, that's kind of weird. How could you not be wanting to give praise to God? Well, think about it. Psalm 141 verse 7 says, "As when one plows and breaks up the earth, so shall our bones be scattered at the mouth of Sheol." Oh boy, it doesn't sound like there's much left of you there. Boy, oh boy, this Sheol place sure sounds like annihilation, doesn't it? Like your bones are scattered, just like the plow scatters the ground. I mean, geez, it doesn't sound like there's really much left of you at all, even if you do have some kind of consciousness after death, right? And while we're in the vicinity, let me just add this one passage from the book of Ecclesiastes where Solomon gives this eerie piece of advice to the living, saying, hey, whatever your hands find to do, do it now with your might. For there is no work, no thought, no knowledge, or wisdom in Sheol, to which you are all going. Yikes! If there was a concept of life after death for these ancient Israelites, man, I don't even know what this would look like. I mean, because there's no work, no thought, no knowledge, no wisdom in it. I mean, right? I mean, truly, Sheol is a place of utter and complete rest, in inactivity, where the soul, where if the soul, is preserved and maintained with life, man, it's a pretty pale and empty existence. But at least it's not a fiery place of hell that we Christians think of. Because no, there's no mention of flames anywhere in the Old Testament concerning Sheol. There's no valley of judgment. There's no suffering in the afterlife for the people of the Old Testament. They weren't worried about that. Any ideas about God's judgment or justice or a literal burning fire is all contained within the judgments that people received in this life, in one's physical life, while they're on earth. There's nothing like a hell idea in Sheol. So if we're looking to find passages in the Old Testament that confirm your belief that people go to hell and are burned alive eternally for their sins, you're simply not going to find them. They don't exist. That's not what the ancient Mesopotamian people believed happened in the afterlife. If the Israelites even believed in a conscious afterlife at all. Which I tend to think that they did, but certainly wasn't much of an existence. Now, one last thing about this time period in Israel's history. Because I know there's some of you out there that have already think about this in the back of your head. There's a whole chapter in 1 Samuel where King Saul allegedly conjures up the dead, deceased spirit of the prophet Samuel. You can read that in chapter 28, and this is probably the strangest proof text that the ancient Israelites did believe that human spirits continued on in some sort of existence after death. Back in the law of Moses, there were commandments given to not seek out those people who deal in divination and mediums who claim to be contacting the dead. There's strict warnings against that. Don't go see those people. And what's interesting in all that God doesn't confirm that there really is life after death for departed spirits, but rather he just warns the people about seeking out this type of spirit medium intercession. Isn't that interesting? God just says stay away from it. Don't get involved in it. Don't practice it at all. Now, some could take that to mean that God was placing a limit on what humans should do concerning these departed spirits that really did exist in a conscious state, but there's another way of looking at this as well. The ancient Israelites had a robust view of the spiritual realm, the unseen realm. The spiritual realm did not consist of just one God, Yahweh, but all types of other spiritual beings that Yahweh made, like angels. A lot of these were given the Hebrew word Elohim, and even spirits that were, maybe not totally obedient to God. You can find that, I believe, in Psalm 82, when God just starts, just rebuking these Elohim in his heavenly court, saying, hey, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, it mentions when the people followed gods other than Yahweh, that people were actually following demons and other rogue spiritual beings. They weren't just worshiping an idol. There was actually some demons behind these other God concepts. So yes, the ancient Israelites believed that there were other beings that inhabited the world and that they could be contacted and interacted with. There were other lowercase g gods out there and a whole unseen realm of spiritual agents. Therefore, it's possible that God's warning to the Israelites about not seeking mediums was intended so that the Israelites did not get mixed up with these rogue spiritual agents, these false gods and demons. Sure, it's possible to conclude that the departed spirit of the prophet Samuel was actually contacted and brought up from Sheol to speak to Saul. That's how that chapter goes in 1 Samuel. But it's also possible that this medium woman that Saul went to go see was not actually contacting a departed human spirit, but actually interacting with evil spirits that were impersonating. And that's why God commanded his people to never seek out the dead, right? Because human beings were limited in their ability to discern whether they're actually speaking to a deceased person that you thought you were, or if you're being duped by an evil spirit. So that's all I'm going to say about that one. And you can check out that passage on your own if you wanted to dig into it more, because it certainly is a weird one. It's the only time where we have any evidence for making a case that someone was contacted beyond the grave, or that there actually is a conscious existence after death in the Old Testament. But it does make it a pretty good case that at least the ancient Israelites believed that there was some part of the person that survived after death, but certainly there was no hell-like condition or resurrection to speak of, or any type of judgment or anything like that. It was a very idle place, inanimate state. All right, we're getting close to the end here, guys. Just a few pages left. Now that I've set up how the earliest people of the Old Testament viewed life after death, well, rather the non-life or the vague, shadowy, and inanimate life after death realm, let me finish with how this view changed as it developed over the next centuries. Yeah, in the book of Job and many Psalms and even some of the other historical books of the Old Testament, there is every now and then some hints about some kinds, some hope and restoration from Sheol. Just some hints, some teases, but they're very uncommon and only vague in reference. None of them are clear-cut or definitive that you could emphatically say, aha, this passage proves that there is a full and robust life after death, and that there's hope and something to look forward to, like a resurrection. No, that wasn't the case. Sheol, the pit, the grave, it remained this dark place of death that no one returns from. Now the prophet Isaiah personifies Sheol in Isaiah 14 as he gives a prophetic warning to the king of Babylon, saying, Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to greet you, all who are the leaders of the earth. It, Sheol, rises up from their thrones. It raises them from their thrones who are kings of the nations, and all of them are going to answer you, king of Babylon, and say, you too have become weak as we. You've become like us. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol, and the sound of your harps. Maggots are laid at your bed beneath you, and your worms are your covers. Now, is Isaiah just personifying Sheol and giving this lamentation, this prophetic, declaration towards the king of Babylon? Or are there really departed spirits that are going to come to meet this Babylonian king to snub their noses at him and shame him because he's lost all of his glory and ended up in this shadowy world of Sheol like a common person and has nothing like everybody else, where there's no thought or work or knowledge or wisdom or no remembrance of God? Well, you can take either position you want. Either way, I've established that Sheol was not a place of hope where one waited for any type of redemption or judgment or resurrection. You were either dead as a doornail when you died and ceased to exist, or your afterlife experience in Sheol was completely subdued, restful, dark, shadowy. And I should also say here that along the same lines that I mentioned when I said how when God gave the law of Moses, he did not talk about life after death. Similarly, there's no passages in the rest of the Old Testament where God gives any definitive statements on the nature of life after death. He never confirms that a shadowy underworld named Sheol exists. Sheol could very well just be the fallen cultural belief of all the Mesopotamian people in the ancient Near East that they carried with them. And when God entered into their story, he accommodated their narrative and spoke from within it to bring about a later progressive revelation in the person of Jesus. I mean, that's my take. I don't believe God was ever supporting this shadowy underworld belief of Sheol, but rather was speaking from within their narrative to bring truth that would later be revealed in Jesus. One of the reasons why I believe this is because of when the Old Testament's view of the afterlife changed. Because it's been the same all the way up to this point. And that's what I want to conclude with right now, because the view of the afterlife did change for the people of the Old Testament. If we go back to Israel's history for a moment, remember that after the period of the kings, the nation was divided. Well, actually they were divided during the kings, but they were divided. But specifically all of them were, okay, not all of them, but the nation was divided into two kingdoms, and both of these two kingdoms got taken away. They got invaded by invaders and they were carried into captivity. First in the 8th century BC, when the Assyrians came from the north and conquered the northern kingdoms of Israel and led them captive. And then in the 6th century BC, when the Babylonians captured the southern kingdom of Judah and took many of its elite citizens out into exile. It was here that cultures mixed and shared ideas, because the elite Israelites were now immersed in these new cultures, and the cultures influenced them, and vice versa. And there are many different ideas about the afterlife and the surrounding nations during Israel's exile, especially for those northern tribes. They went all over the place, the diaspora. People had all different types of ideas. Well, for example, the Egyptians, they always had a strong belief in the afterlife and even the possibility of a resurrection back into a physical body. We know this because that's why the bodies of the kings were mummified and preserved, so that could aid in the resurrection. But of course, the Israelites were, pillaged and taken away, not to Egypt. So we're not going to look at the Egyptians for influence about the afterlife. When the northern 10 tribes of Israel were taken away by the Assyrians in the 8th century, all those northern 10 tribes became known as the diaspora, and they more or less just spread out. And their story disappears from the Old Testament. That's the end of their story. Their lineage, their storyline ends when they're taken away. But the one tribe that was more faithful to Yahweh God of these 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of Judah in the south, and they kept and preserved the storyline of the people of Yahweh. And they remained in their promised land, in this Palestinian land, this former Canaanite land, for another 2 centuries, till the 6th century. And then they were taken away by the Babylonians. Now, I'm really sorry about this boring history stuff. But as I'm wrapping this episode up, it's really important here to understand the development of the afterlife that happened right here during this time period, because a few decades after Judah, the southern kingdom, was taken away by the Babylonians in the 6th century by these Babylonian people, the Persians took over, right? Talking like Iran, modern day Iran. They took over Babylon and absorbed the Babylonian Empire. That would have been Alexander the Great. And they absorbed this Babylonian Empire into their empire. And when it came to the afterlife, holy moly, these Persians had a completely different view than everything we've just read in the Old Testament. Not only did they believe that the world was embattled between a good God and an evil counterpart, right? Kind of like our God and Satan today. The Persians also believed in a full and robust life after death, including a resurrection of all the dead back in the physical bodies, a judgment that God doles out to all by a literal fire and molten metal, and a restoration of creation back to the purification and perfection where humans live as immortal beings in peace. Wow, does that sound familiar, guys? Because it should, because that's pretty much the exact view that Christians hold today. But back then, it was a view that the Persians had. We call those views Zoroastrianism. And it's precisely here, right where the Persians took over Babylon in the 6th century, when the Judah, the southern kingdom, was taken captive. We see a huge, significant change happening in the Old Testament. And we see it happening in the book of Daniel. Just as the book of Daniel cites for itself, it says it was during the time of King Cyrus, who was the first Persian king of this newly acquired Babylonian territory that the Persians now had. That's the time and context that Daniel sets itself in. Wow, isn't history cool? Now, whether the book of Daniel was actually written in the 6th century, when King Cyrus had taken over, or whether it was actually written closer to the time of Jesus, is a matter of great debate among scholars, with most, if not many, if not most, favoring this latter view that the book of Daniel was written maybe only a couple hundred years before Jesus, maybe 150, 200. But however you slice it, it's impossible to miss that it's in this book of Daniel, during the Persian reign, that Daniel drops an H-bomb in chapter 12. The bomb comes out of nowhere when you read it along with the historical narrative about the afterlife in all those older Old Testament books, all the way from Genesis, all the way through Israel's history and the prophets and so forth. Daniel does something concerning the afterlife that no other prophet had done until his time. And he does it blatantly and obviously. Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 says this. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people. There shall be a time of trouble, such as never been since there was a nation till that time. But at the time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book of life. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness will shine like the stars forever and ever. I'll just point out first from that passage I just read that notice how Daniel says that those who sleep in the dust of the earth. That's like a reference to Genesis 3, right? So it's hard to make a case that Daniel was talking about some state of a conscious existence for the dead. He's saying that they're all sleeping and in a state of rest. But regardless about how you think about it, Daniel drops his bomb that those who are dead shall awake, shall come back into a physical body, and that when this happens, they're going to face judgment, in which some are going to go into everlasting life and some are going to go into everlasting contempt. I'm telling you folks, you can read the whole Old Testament over till you're blue in the face, and there's no other passages quite like anything like this in the Old Testament. It's one of a kind. It's the only passage that exists like this that is clear, straightforward, and an indisputable statement about life after death. It might be the only passage, right? And not only life after death, but also that there is some type of a life or some type of a judgment that occurs afterwards that determines one's destiny for this afterlife. Well, actually, there is one other passage, is Isaiah 26, about the dead living and bodies rising again, but that shadowy promise is concerning only the people of Israel, as God promises to them comfort for their current suffering. This one from Daniel, though, is far clearer. It's more exact, directly, prophetically pointing to a future time that's not concerning a mere promise of a blissful afterlife that Isaiah sounds like, but talking about a grand, general resurrection for all people of the earth, in which some, they don't enter into eternal life, but this negative type of judgment from God. All right, and one other piece of little information I want to give here, that influenced Jewish culture and thought, in addition to the Persian, right? It was the Hellenization of that part of the world, the East, that took place in the 4th century BC. I told you there's this boring history stuff, and actually I think that was Alexander the Great that where this took over. I probably said the wrong one with the Persian thing, but Alexander conquered much of the known world, before he was 32, and with it, he brought all this Greek culture and arts, language, and religion into these areas, and the common language of the world now just changed to Greek. It's when the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament was done. Even the land of Israel, the main language was Greek, and all these Greek ideas got mixed together, these cultures. It was called the Hellenization of the East. And then when the Roman Empire took over a few centuries later, right before Jesus came, they brought all their views of the afterlife too, with Hades and Elysium and, being the place of the virtuous, and Tartarus being the place of punishment to the wicked, right? So all these cultural influences more than likely shaped and influenced the latter development of the afterlife of the Jewish people. And what we'll do now, as we close, is look at the few centuries that spanned the time between when the Old Testament closed with the book of Malachi and when Jesus arrived. And this is pivotal, folks. This is when the Bible's narrative takes this huge turn here. Well, I shouldn't say the Bible's narrative. It's this intertestamental period. And we shouldn't be afraid about these new ideas. I mean, maybe the Persians, they had a more truer understanding, a picture of the afterlife than what the Israelites did. Maybe God was working with them in a way, and that shouldn't be anything weird. I mean, it's the beauty that God's working with other people, other than this only little tiny nation of Israel. But so wrapping this all up here, even though the pages of the Old Testament come to an end, and that's 400 years before Jesus comes, there's this intertestamental period of writing during the time. before the New Testament's written. And you can find a lot of these books in your, Catholic Bibles have them. It's listed under the Apocrypha, which was like the book of Judith and Wisdom and Tobit and 1st, 2nd, 3rd Maccabees. And everything I just said about these new developments and the concepts surrounding life after death, after the Persian and the Hellenistic influence, they begin to play out in this Apocrypha, in these writings, these intertestamental writings. Here you see more affirmations about the resurrection of the dead, more affirmations about post-mortem judgment coming to the righteous and the unrighteous, and writings about a possible annihilation and destruction, or even an eternal punishment of the wicked. That's where all this stuff pops up. Although all those themes, they're absent from the rest of the Old Testament that we have, except for those two obvious passages I mentioned, Daniel and Isaiah. They're finally developed here in these apocryphal intertestamental writings. Most of these writings, they're not in your average, Bible. So that's why you see such a leap in theology concerning the life after death from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And there's other books written during this time as well that aren't even in the Apocrypha, but they were accepted in popular readings among the religious leaders of the Jews back then, such as the book of Enoch. Oh yeah. And the thing about Enoch that's specific to our study on hell in these miniseries is that Enoch takes the idea of the punishment and suffering of the wicked in the afterlife to a whole new level, guys. In the Old Testament, everyone goes to Sheol, which means you all just end up dying and cease to exist, or you end up in some shadowy underworld where there's hardly any conscious activity going on, and that's just where you remain. You go down there and you don't come back, right? Everybody entered there. There was no distinction between the righteous and the unrighteous, or the people that were good or bad. They just all experienced the same fate of Sheol, and there was no impending judgment to wait for or to deal with, to have to deal with. But Enoch completely redefines all that Old Testament precedent and instead suggests that the disembodied spirits of the wicked are tormented. That those who die wicked on earth finally are met with God's justice, or his judgment and justice, in a conscious afterlife. Where before the wicked of the Old Testament would just die and that was it, the book of Enoch suggested that the disembodied spirit continued on and would be punished for all the evil deeds committed on earth. Additionally, in some places of the books of Enoch, because there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're organized differently, they suggest that the wicked would be punished forever, without end. Much how many people view the traditional view of hell that I outlined in that last podcast episode on, eternal conscious punishment. Some passages in the book of Enoch suggest that the departed spirits of evildoers are fully conscious, and that their suffering goes on in eternity without end. And then when we talk about fire, boy, there's a lot about how the wicked suffer punishment in afterlife going through fire and burning. That's what Enoch gives us. No, there's no idea like that in the Old Testament at all, in those books, for the dead. But it shows up here in Enoch. And that was a really, really important book for the religious leaders of Jesus' day, and for the good 100 years or more beyond that before he was around. So this was the type of literature that was, and ideas that were very strong during that time. All that to say, guys, is that when Jesus comes on the scene in the first century, this more developed view of a conscious afterlife, where one awaited judgment and resurrection, was now in place in Jewish thought, however it got there. But it wasn't like it was a consensus, right? There was a whole bunch of debate among the religious leaders of Jesus' day, right? The Sadducees, they didn't even believe in the resurrection of the dead. And Jesus had to set them straight on that in Matthew 22. Well, but for the Pharisees, they did believe in a resurrection of the dead, and they also believed that a later judgment was going to follow. They must have been reading the book of Enoch. There are ancient Jewish predecessors. They would have not have believed in this because in that Old Testament books it wasn't in there. But these Jewish leaders of Jesus' day, they must have been influenced by this intertestamental writings and the traditions of this period. So, but what exactly this end-time judgment entailed, whether it was going to be an eternal burning with literal fire, or whether it was a punishment that just lasted for a short time that then ended and that, the wicked just were annihilated, ceased to be, or whether it was all that just symbolic language, a symbolic fire that actually, well, maybe it punished, but it actually served to eventually bring about a purification and a restoration to the wicked. I mean, all those ideas, that was not settled fact. Not at all. Not the way Christians think of hell today, where we think of this just settled fact. The type of judgment that Yahweh was going to be bringing at the end of the age for the wicked, that was open for debate. And you can see all those ideas represented in these intertestamental texts. And some of the Jewish writings that came from the centuries that followed, after Jesus as well, for the next couple hundred years after Jesus, the Jewish folks still wrote about this judgment. Some writings, like Enoch, leaned more heavily towards eternal conscious punishment. And some passages lean more towards just the utter death and annihilation of the soul. And then others lean towards restoration or purgative. For example, in some of the Jewish midrash that was written in the centuries after Jesus, I was just talking about, the time for the wicked to receive their punishment was 12 months. You spend 12 months in the fire. And then after that, the wicked would be purified from their evil. And they would come out restored. They were not annihilated, and they were not eternally punished. So there's lots of different thoughts about, yes, there's going to be a judgment. What was it going to look like? So the views were quite open to what God's judgment and punishment would actually be. So therefore, this theological limbo on the final state of the dead, that was the setting and context that Jesus came onto the scene in the first century. It was a more conservative opinion or position to believe that life continued after you died, that people were going to be judged and suffer consequences for their actions, and that a resurrection of the dead would come to pass, where the faithful were rewarded and the unfaithful were going to have to come to terms with their evil hearts. But how exactly was God going to bring about his justice? That was no settled fact at all. It certainly was not settled fact in the books that make up our Orthodox Old Testament, the ones that we use. And it was not settled fact even in those intertestamental books of the Apocrypha or during the time of Jesus. But that's it, folks. Hopefully that gives you a better and a real nice basic overview and understanding of how the concept of life after death evolved and developed throughout the Old Testament, and specifically in this time period leading up to Jesus. And that's going to be really important for us to know as we continue on this series on what the hell, as we really drill down on what Jesus wanted us to take away from his teachings about the afterlife and about the judgment and about the resurrection and about the restoration of all things. Was Jesus trying to endorse the vivid pictures of eternal conscious torment that were sometimes portrayed in First Enoch that we kind of imagine from a traditional view of hell? Was Jesus endorsing this idea of eternal fire and eternal burning for the unrepentant? Or was Jesus, just as I suspect God was doing with the fallen cultural concept of Sheol, once again entering into the fallen narrative and using that fallen imagery, only to bring us a more clear understanding of the soon coming judgment and the afterlife that actually looks like his non-violent life, his non-violent ministry, and the ultimate non-violent death on the cross. Boy, this series is going to get interesting. That's what I'm hoping to help us discover in these next upcoming episodes, and I hope you'll join me as we walk through all this together. That's it for today. See you in the next one, and be blessed.